When were you born?
March 1st, 1924.
Where?
New York City.
You lived there your whole life?
Yeah, I've lived in and out of the city. I was in the Army for 4 years. Did some time in Colorado, in Texas, Missouri. Fought the Battle of the Bulge. Wound up in Austria. And came home, and then my wife and I did a lot of traveling in Europe. We lived in London for a while, but we always came back to New York City.
What got you into writing?
Well, when I was quite young, probably 10, I knew I wanted to either write or draw. And when I was 12, I caught a case of scarlet fever, which was a pretty prevalent thing back in those days and could be a very nasty disease. So the doctor instructed my mother to keep me in bed for a week. So she said, "What do you want to do in bed for a week?" And I said, "I want to draw. Bring me some pencils and papers, please." So she got the pencils, but she didn't have much paper around the house. So what she brought me were a stack of contract bridge pads. She was into contract bridge. And if you turn one of those pads on its size, it's kind of like a comic strip size. So I set out to write a comic strip. And the story was about a mutiny on board a luxury liner. Nobody told me that they didn't have mutinies on luxury liners. They have them on oilers and industrial ships of one sort or another, but not on luxury liners. It's a good thing nobody told me it, because I drew 27 pages of mutiny on the luxury liner. And I don't know when I noticed it, whether I noticed it before I was done or after, but I eventually noticed that as I got into it, the balloons kept getting bigger and bigger, more and more type, and the pictures kept getting smaller and smaller. So I decided, I think maybe I want to write more than I want to draw. I'd like to do both, but I think I like writing more. So that's how it started.
Were you a good English student when you were in school?
Yeah, that was my number one subject. English and biology were my two best subjects.
Did you enter a writing contest, or did you practice on your own?
I started trying to write a novel when I was about 16. Didn't get very far with it, but I did make an attempt. It was the year that I was influenced by Hemingway. It didn't last more than a year, I don't think. I wrote some stuff for the school newspaper, drew some cartoons as well. I used to enter contests that called for making up slogans for companies and so on. I won a couple of prizes for doing that. And I remember one of them was to give the name of a slipper that they had, a fuzzy slipper that they had, give it a name, and I called it Pedi-furs. Pedi-furs.
Play on words? Your first major pun title, huh?
Yeah. I won a couple of those. Then in the Army, I started getting more serious about it. I wrote a couple of shows. I was writing it in the middle of the battle. When we were in the Battle of the Bulge, we were coming down the highway, and I was standing in the turret of this half-track that I lived in those days. And I was singing, I don't like this war, baby, I don't want to stay. Then when the European campaign ended, we were waiting to be shipped back to California and from there to Japan. So nobody knew how long we were going to be waiting. So I went into the CO's office and I said, look, as long as we got to sit on our asses, if it's for an extended period of time, sir, I think that there's going to be problems with morale. So with your cooperation, I would like to put together a show for the guys. And he said, okay, and I did. And originally it was just for the company, which is about 240 men. But the little German theater that we had there was a movie house that we converted. It held about 80 people or so, so we had to do 3 performances. And by the time we did the 3rd performance, they were sending guys over from other units to look at it. So they asked us then to do it for the entire division, and then we were asked to do it for the Army, I guess it was. We wound up doing it in an open field in Germany with Jeep headlights for our stage, and we played to, I don't know, maybe 20,000 guys. And it was very successful, but the next morning, the colonel called me in and said, "You told an obscene story last night," and I had 3 nurses at that performance. And I said, "Sir, I didn't know there'd be any nurses, so I would not have told an obscene story." Now, here's how obscene that particular story was. 2 homosexuals get into a fight, and at some point, one of them screams at the other, "You can kiss my ass," and the other one says, "I don't want to make up." That was the obscene story that the colonel reprimanded me for.
When you got out of the war, had you written professionally before you went into the service?
Yeah, I wrote something that was on a city station in New York, a historic thing. It was an adaptation of the death of Socrates. I just remembered in that show, I had an act consisting of 3 German POWs who are singing a song, the chorus of which went, "Peace, peace, peace on you. Be a little bunch of victims of a madman and his crew. La-di-da-da." What did I do when I got out? I bummed around for a year or more, didn't do much of anything. Then I went back to school, took a course in creative writing, and the course had one demand of you, and that was that by the end of the course you would have completed a book. So I wrote a mystery novel called The Steel Noose, and I sold it. So when the course ended, I decided I knew what I wanted to do, and there didn't seem much point in continuing with college. Rather, I should get out there and do it. I wrote some pulp mysteries, which I'm still trying to recover. I lost a lot of my early stuff in a fire, and there were 2 pulp mystery yarns that I'd love to reread, but I can't locate them. But when I got into Pulps, which would have been about 1951 or 52, they were starting to fold, getting the pressure from one side of the 25-cent paperback novel, which gave you much more for your money than their 10 and 15-cent pulp magazines did. And the other pressure was coming from this new thing called comic books, which had now crossed over into science fiction and superheroes' adventures of one sort or another. They were no longer comic books. Somebody took the comedy out of comic books. So as a result, the guys who had been reading Argosy and Blue Book were able to get much the same kind of thing, plus pictures. So between those 2 pressures, the pulp industry was collapsing. So I decided that the place to go was comics. And at that point, I met a guy named Leslie Waller, a very bright young man from Chicago who had also just gotten out of the Army, who had already sold a novel. He was going to Columbia. So we decided to pool forces and write some stuff together. And we sold a couple of Westerns to Fawcett, I think it was. And that got us started. And then I met a neighbor of my brother Milton. My brother Milton was living in Riverdale at that time. Milton was living in an apartment house a few floors from a fortunate young man named Bob Kane, and they became friendly, and then Milton told Bob that I was a writer or beginning to be a writer, and Kane wondered whether I might be able to help him to start a new strip. So we met and we decided we would take a swing at it. And we wrote something called Nick O'Time, O''Tyme, which was a kind of a satire on Dick Tracy, except as I explained to Bob Kane, the problem was that Dick Tracy was already a satire. So it was a satire on a satire. But I had a crack at it, and I think I did a fairly good job. Bob showed it to one syndicate, they turned it down. Bob had absolutely no experience with rejection. He had been successful from the time he was about 17 when he first created this rather crude concept that later became Batman. So he could not understand or accept any form of rejection, and all that work that we did got rolled up and stuck in the closet, never to be heard from again. But in the meantime, he introduced me to the gang over at D.C., Mort, Weisinger, may his name continue to live in infamy, Jack Shipp, a really nice guy, Murray Boltonoff, a guy who might have been the best editor there, except he didn't know it, and if he didn't know that, nobody else knew it. It was too bad about that. He didn't recognize how valuable he was. Began writing for Weisinger, and then I quickly understood that Weisinger was a practicing sadist, and the object of his sadism most of the time were his writers and his artists. And after I worked with him for a year or less, I told him that I thought that it was going to cost me more in psychiatric care than I could earn by working for him, and publicly announced that I was no longer working for Mort. And by some editorial understanding they had there, if you didn't want to work with Mort, you didn't get to work with anybody else. So for a while I didn't. And then during that time, Jack Shipp and I were trying to crack TV with some story ideas. So we were putting in some nights together working on that. But he still really wasn't qualified to hire me as a writer because Mort would have objected. One day Irwin walked in and turned to me and said, "How come you're not doing any more stories for us?" And then the thing came out in the open and he said, "Forget it, go to work for Jack or Murray or Julie, but forget about Mort." So that's what I did. And then one curious day, Mort walked in and said to me, "I have an idea that I'd like you to take a crack at." And I knew how he felt about me because he knew how I felt about him. So the fact that he did it interested me because I knew there must have been something happening there of value. So I said, okay. I sat down with him and he said, "I'm going to do a string of magazines. We're going to call them Showcase, and each one's going to be a different hero. And if a title proves successful, we'll pull it out of the line and give it its own run." So I said, "That's a marvelous idea. What you're going to do is audition comic books." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Fabulous. I'm going to go home and come up with a couple of interesting characters, and I'll bring them back to you in a few days." And he said, "No, don't worry about that." He said, "I know what the first book's going to be about." And I said, "What?" And he said, "It's going to be about a fireman." So I said, "Kids don't want to be firemen anymore, Mort. They did when you and I were children, but not anymore. And they want to be brain surgeons. They want to work on rocketry, this new thing called computers." He said, "I don't think they really want to be firemen." And he said, "Don't worry about it. When I put fire on a cover, it sells. Kids are fascinated with fire." He also believed that they were fascinated with gold and diamonds and jewelry of all sorts. So what he was looking into was his own head when he thought he was looking into the kids. So I said, "Okay, I will do it. I will do the best job that I can, but I don't think it's going to work." So he said, "You let me worry about that." And I did. I went home. I spent, I think, close to 3 days researching it, which for a comic book is a lot of time. Our research generally ran 10 to 20 minutes. So I wrote it, and it was pretty good. I wrote it as a 3-generation story, all firemen, about how fighting fires changed over the years, how you fight different kinds of fires. The wind-up story was about a fire in a circus, handling the animals and so on. It was kind of interesting, but as I predicted, it was a bomb. Probably sold 20% or less. The result of that is they got back, 80% of the copies, and they chopped them up and threw them away. And now there are very few copies left, and they are quite valuable, which led me to say nothing succeeds like failure. I have 2 copies of those, and they will help to put my grandkids, through college. At that point, I was working mostly with Jack Shipp, doing Batman, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Challengers of the Unknown, And then I began working with Kashdan, doing much the same stuff, and finally wound up working with Boltonov, at which point Boltonov took over the comedy series. He had Bob Hope and Jerry Lewis comics, Dobie Gillis, Fox and Crow, that was there. So Murray asked me to do it. He didn't know very much about comedy writing. I took over not one magazine, but a whole block of them, and they were all in trouble. All the comedy magazines were in trouble at that time. The humor magazines were in trouble, and my job was to figure out why. And it seemed pretty clear to me that the major problem was that the editors were writing for their own generation rather than for kids of that time. I told Murray right off the bat, I said, the kids don't know who Bob Hope is, and Jerry Lewis is that guy who appears once a year for muscular dystrophy, and that's about it. So he said, well, what would you do? And I said, let's go with what they're interested in. Monsters, science fiction, the same kind of stuff that's selling our other magazines. We do it for humor, for laughs. So he said, okay. So in the Bob Hope book I gave Bob a young ward of sorts. He was the son of an old school chum of Bob's. His school chum's name was, he was a football player at college, and his name was Crazy Legs Jute Fruits. And so he went into business manufacturing jute fruits, fruit juices. What else would he do, right? And he was constantly traveling for business. So he had his son living with Bob for a while. And the son was like a 14 or 15-year-old scientific genius. But with that genius came the belief that human emotions were a waste of time, caused the brain to malfunction and so forth. So he would not permit himself any kind of emotion. But because he was constantly pushing the emotion down into himself, not ever releasing it, every once in a while it would explode. And when it did, he turned into something called Super Hip, who was a character who was the diametric opposite of Tad Wallader. He was a rock and roll singer. He had an electric guitar that he could fly with, all kinds of powers to, like, turn himself into a bottle of ketchup and pour ketchup on the villain's head and things of that nature. Tad went to a school called Benedict Arnold High. And Benedict Arnold High was a school with a faculty of monsters. The chemistry teacher was a witch of some sort. The chemistry teacher was a vampire. He was called Dr. Von Vampire. The mummy was the driving instructor, right? The principal of the school had a coffin in his office where he would like to take a nap occasionally. We turned the whole thing into a monster comedy, and it worked almost instantly. It shot up like 20 points in a month. And then I went to work on the Jerry Lewis thing, and I gave him, again, a kid. I wanted a relationship in both those books to one of the characters. And so in Jerry Lewis, we had like an 8 or 9-year-old who was not a scientific genius, who was a pain in the ass. And Jerry hired a housekeeper to try to help him out to handle this kid without knowing that the housekeeper was a witch. So that was kind of fun, the constant battle between Renfrew, the kid, and witchcraft. Both of those did pretty well.
How fast did you write? I mean, how many pages? You normally do an 8 or 10 page story for those books?
No, I used to do like 16, 18.
A full book?
A week, perhaps.
So you would do that entire line, would take you a month to get all the script for those books done?
Maybe, yeah.
And did you get much input from the editors once you started plotting?
No, all I knew was that the books were doing well. Irwin Donenfeld thought he had made an enormous discovery that the elements on a cover could be isolated and you could figure out exactly why the cover sold, and then you could just repeat that. So he had things that made covers sell, primarily asses and tits, I would say. But there were a few other things, like Weisinger's theory that money and diamonds and so forth sell books. Irwin had the same theories. His major claim to fame for years, right until he died, I think, was that he had invented this book where he put little photographs of the covers in the book and the sales figures beside each one, and he could just open it up, figure out immediately how they were doing and how to improve the covers and get that sail back up and so forth. The line just continued to sink, in general. The humor line was doing fairly well at that point, but everything else was continuing to sink. Stanley was beginning to paste their ears back, and they were paying no attention.
It's because they had done things the way they had always done them, and they always figured that was the way it was going to be,
Yeah.
and it was going to work fine for them, and damned to be anyone else.
They thought they had the formula. And I wrote this infamous 7-page memorandum to Irwin, which I tried to explain why they were in trouble, or would be. I thought they already were, but the numbers weren't showing it yet. And I pointed out what Stan was doing and why he was doing it and why it was working and what they could do in response to it. And Irwin shook his head and said, "You don't understand. We outsell him 2 or 3 to 1. And I said, "Well, that's this year, but I'm talking about next year and the year after."
A lot of that had to do with their ability
Yeah.
to distribute books.
Sure. Yeah. And his theory about Stan's distribution was one of the reasons that Stan was doing well was that he was appealing to the inner cities. And I wanted to know whether Irwin thought that a black kid's dime wasn't as good as a white kid's dime.
Yeah, money's money.
Yeah, well, there was a fair amount of racism in the business all along the way. I tried on 3 separate occasions in 3 separate publishing houses to get black characters into the stories. Could not do it.
Doom Patrol in there. I mean, that was a pretty interesting concept for a DC book. How did you get them to accept something like that?
Desperation. They were in trouble. They were looking for any way out. Particularly Boltinoff. They kept giving him sinking books. So he was constantly desperate. The result was he gave me a lot of leeway on the Doom Patrol, and he did quite well. And then he opened up this Fox and Crow, which was sinking rapidly, and that's where I put Stanley and his monster. And that held up pretty well for a while. But in general, the house was not changing its image and was not altering its aims, its goals.
Do you think it did eventually?
Oh yeah, they had to.
You think it was because Giordano came in and Infantino was there and they changed the overall corporate editorial structure?
Yeah, I think that they were both much more conscious of what Stanley was doing and why he was doing it than the rest of the house was. Yeah, and when Infantino came in, what he did immediately was change the look, and that helped a great deal. But the insides didn't change very much. So at that point, I had just come back from living in London, and I saw what was going on, and I went into Irwin's office, and I said, "Look, you know how I feel about the way things have been going and why I felt that Stan was going to be pasting our ears back sooner or later." And I said, "You made a very good move by putting Carmine in charge of revamping the look of the magazine, and it's working. But," I said, "the insides aren't changing, or at least not rapidly enough. That has to be done, and I'm offering myself as the guy to do it." I said, "I think between Carmine and myself, we could probably turn this whole thing around in a year or 2 at the most." And he said, "Well, I'll have to think that over." So I said, "How long do you think it will take you to make a decision?" And he said, "About 6 months." So at that point, of course, I clearly knew that he thought I was a schmuck who would believe that a decision of this sort would be made over a period of 6 months.
Is there any particular character or set of characters that you created that you kind of felt a great sense of ownership with, even though it was for a company that you worked for?
Yeah, all the characters in the Doom Patrol. Right now, in particular, Beast Boy, because he's become so popular.
And what do you think about the way the artist has interpreted your scripts? Do you feel generally that Premiani, for example, portrayed your feel for the characters?
I think Premiani was extraordinary, really extraordinary. I've seen other guys try to do what he did, and they just don't make it. I often use the term artistic integrity, and it's not really a bullshit term. It has significance. He had that. He, fortunately, in addition to that, he had practicality. He had lived under two dictators, Mussolini and Perón, and he had learned practicality. So when he would get into a disagreement with Murray about something that he had drawn, he would finally accede to Murray's demand, and he inevitably would say, "I will do it, Murray, but it will be very poor."
That's a great thing to end on.